In a move that has shocked the world, Ukraine has just launched a daring invasion into Russia, flipping the script on a war that many thought they understood. But this assault didn't come out of nowhere. For months, Ukraine has been meticulously setting the stage with a series of calculated strikes deep into Russian territory. These weren't random attacks, they were precision strikes, each one part of a master plan. With every hit, Ukraine was not only probing Russia's defenses, but also exposing Putin's vulnerabilities for the world to see. These strikes revealed the cracks in Russia's armor, and now, as the world watches in awe, Ukraine's true strategy is revealed. A meticulously crafted plan to strike Russia where it hurts most. Ukrainians consider that Russia did not invade their country in 2022, but nearly 10 years earlier, in 2014, when Russian special forces, the so-called Little Green Men, occupied Crimea and annexed it at the bidding of Russian President Vladimir Putin. At the same time, Russian-armed and Russian-backed separatists, supported by elements of the Russian army and Russian special forces, also occupied parts of the Donetsk and Donbass regions in eastern Ukraine. A protracted low-intensity conflict began. In February 2022, the Russian army launched a full-scale conventional attack into the rest of Ukraine, aiming at capturing Kyiv, the capital, and decapitating the government. After initial advances, the Russian army was halted amid extremely high numbers of casualties, thousands of troops, armored vehicles, and combat aircraft. The Russian military's inability to conduct rudimentary battlefield tactics, let alone undertake more complex combined arms operations, was exposed. After years of poor investment and corruption, the Russian army was exposed as a hollow shell. Vladimir Putin's three-day special military operation, intended to take Kyiv and bring down the democratically elected Ukrainian government in a lightning strike, is now in its third year. The Russian advance slowed to a crawl and was even forced back in some areas, and then it came to a halt. Artillery barrages have turned woods and forests into splintered wastelands, highly reminiscent of Western France during the First World War. Tank and mechanized infantry forces slug it out. Russian infantry advance hesitantly across no man's land to be targeted by swarms of small drones mounting grenades and RPG rounds. But a stalemate does not win a war. Russia's sheer size, its factory capacity and its manpower helps to compensate for its high losses. Despite Russia's willingness to expend thousands of its own soldiers in fruitless, suicidal attacks, a long drawn-out war may be working in its favor. The Russian army is slowly beginning to reconstitute itself in ways that the Ukrainian army, with fewer resources and personnel, is struggling to do. In a few weeks, a new Russian spring offensive looks likely. There are some major challenges facing Ukraine as it contemplates a new Russian attack. Artillery shells are running out, soldiers are running out, and much-needed support from international allies seems to be dwindling. Ukraine has gratefully received the M1 Abrams tank and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles sent by America and a host of other equipment donated by the West, but the numbers are still relatively low. Some critical systems, such as the F-16, have still yet to make it into battle space, despite the conflict being over 2 years old. Is time running out for Ukraine? Last year, there were very high expectations for a Ukrainian counteroffensive once the Ukrainian military had absorbed new Western tanks, artillery, and armored fighting vehicles. But these hopes came to nothing. Artillery, missiles, battlefield drones, trenches, and mines have made the battlefield a harsh and extremely unforgiving environment for either side. Ukrainian mobile forces suffered almost as badly as the Russians. A breakthrough to the coast did not become a reality, and the front lines resumed their static character. But there are still some causes for optimism. The Ukrainian government and military are constantly looking at the best ways to maximize the resources they have, with the emphasis on creativity and initiative as they search for new approaches to defeat the enemy. We'd like to highlight a couple of areas that the Ukrainians are trying to exploit in order to take the war to the Russians, to disrupt their planning and their warfighting capability. Let's talk about the Ukrainian use of long-range drones and the indirect approach to warfare. Since the arrival of air power in the First World War, military commanders have been looking for ways to reach out beyond the front line and into enemy territory to stop enemy men, equipment, and other resources from getting to the battlefield. Far better to stop the guns and render tanks ineffective before they reach the war zone, rather than have to expend men and materiel destroying them after they've arrived, right? There are some good examples from the Second World War. The Battle of the Atlantic was an attempt by German submarines to intercept and sink the thousands of tons of troops, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food supplies that were coming from America and Canada in order to support Britain and the war effort in Europe. This was a battle of supplies and logistics. Every aircraft in the hold of an Allied merchant ship that the Germans could sink was one less that would be dropping bombs on Hitler's Reich. Faced with the prospect of the severing of Britain's vital transatlantic supply line, British war leader Winston Churchill was reported to have said that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Similarly, between 1942 and 44, the American Strategic Bombing Force launched raids against the Romanian Ploiești oil refineries in an effort to hamper the delivery of fuel for Germany's industry, aircraft, and panzer forces. Beyond the hedgerows of Normandy after D-Day, Allied aircraft roamed far behind German lines, swooping down on trains, railways, supply dumps, and communication centers. With a bogged-down battlefield in Ukraine, perhaps some of these lessons from history could be turned to Ukraine's favor. Battlefield drones have been around for a long time now. The US military was using surveillance and strike drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the early part of the century. Since then, the use of drones has rapidly expanded, from small, lightweight drones that can carry a grenade to drop into a trench, through to larger systems that can travel hundreds of miles and carry a heavy payload. When Russia's conventional attack struck Ukraine in February 2022, both sides had a range of commercial and military drones at their disposal, some dating back to the Soviet era. One of the newer military drones, particularly popular with the Ukrainian military, is the Turkish TB2 Bayraktar. With a range of around 300 kilometers, it was Ukraine's only purpose-designed armed UAV. The Bayraktar had proven itself already in recent conflicts in Syria and in Azerbaijan. It can fly continuously for 27 hours and carry 4 laser-guided weapons. The Bayraktar was to become so well received based on its ability to destroy Russian armor that a pop song about it was written in Ukrainian, and there are even reports that children and family pets were named after it. With the critical conditions of war acting as an incentive, Ukrainian drone designers have taken this initial capability several steps further. Much of their early design and development work was amateur and improvised, manufactured at small scale in a basement or a workshop. They were often based on commercial quadcopters that could be bought in a hobby shop or online, or from off-the-shelf systems from China. As Russian bombs and missiles indiscriminately pounded civilian targets and urban areas across Ukraine, Ukrainian military planners were starting to look beyond the immediate front line and consider other ways of taking the war to Russia and disrupting the Russian war effort. With necessity being the mother of invention, Ukrainian forces were soon able to increase their drone attack capabilities and numbers. But Ukraine has been operating under political and humanitarian constraints that are not faced by Russia. The Ukrainian government has been at pains to avoid indiscriminate targeting of civilian sites. Furthermore, Western countries backing Ukraine and providing weapons, equipment, vehicles, and ammunition have been concerned that the weapon systems they provide should not be used to take the war into Russia. This is why specific long-range NATO missile systems, artillery pieces, and combat aircraft have either been slow to arrive or have still not yet been made available to the Ukrainian military. This has meant that the long-range drones that Ukraine can produce and operate themselves with fewer restrictions have taken on a higher prominence in the war. In early 2024, Ukrainian commander Major General Vadim Skibitsky was absolutely clear why the long-range drone campaign was critical to the Ukrainian way of waging war. He said that Ukraine had no choice. He said that victory on the battlefield was no longer possible in the face of Russian military superiority and the Ukrainian deficiencies in artillery shells and combat aircraft. It was essential instead to hit Russian targets beyond the front line, including infrastructure, command centers, and factories. So let's take a look at how the Ukrainian armed forces have been striking back and taking the war into Russia with aerial drones. Remember that it's not always easy to assess whether a particular explosion, fire, or incident is due to a drone. Both sides have been very cautious with information, and disinformation rules the airwaves. There have been many explosive incidents a few kilometers inside Russia. These are just as likely to be connected with artillery, airstrikes, sabotage, small arms fire, or other methods of attacks than they are linked to drones. However, as we get further away from the border and deeper into Russia, it's easier to see the work of drones. On the 22nd of June 2022, the first reports of a possible drone attack in Russia came in. An explosion at the oil refinery at Novosibirsk was attributed to a suicide drone. The refinery was around 150 kilometers from the front line and was believed to have been struck by a Mugin 5 drone, which according to the company website, the commercial version is made of lightweight carbon fiber, has a flight time of 7 hours and can carry a payload of 25 kilograms. Because the earlier drones that were available to the Ukrainian military could only carry relatively light payloads, the planners and the drone operators had to put a high premium on good reconnaissance and intelligence for each mission. It was crucial to understand where the weakest link was in a large target such as a refinery, for example a crucial generator, in order to take it offline with a small but precise strike. Drone attacks were certainly not going to resemble the British and American saturation bombing raids of late World War II. Other reports began to come in of explosions across Russia. On Friday evening of 19th of August, Russian media sources reported drone attacks across in Crimea, other Russian-held parts of Ukraine, and also in Russia, with Russian air defense systems very active. These attacks were still relatively close to Ukraine, but that was to change as the year wore on. Early December 2022, as Russian air and missile strikes were pounding the Ukrainian energy network in an effort to freeze the country, explosions rocked 3 Russian military air bases across western Russia at Kursk, Saratov, and Ryazan. Saratov, the most distant target, is over 700 kilometers away from Ukraine, and Ryazan Air Base, home of Russian heavy bomber aircraft, is only 180 kilometers from Moscow. Let's have a think about what sort of targets the drones were being used against, and what sort of intentions the Ukrainian leadership had when they authorized such attacks. Inevitably and understandably, Ukrainian senior commanders are tight-lipped about their strategies and intentions, but a wide spread of Russian targets are being hit. Almost all of these are either directly military targets or are sites that closely support Russia's military operations, including air bases, oil refineries, drone factories, railways, ships and naval bases, and steel plants. From this we can see that Ukrainian intentions are to strike out beyond the enemy tanks and troops on the front line and hit the strategic assets that power the Russian war machine: air power, transportation, fuel and factories. But many of these drone strikes serve a dual role: to strike at the military, but also to serve as a propaganda victory and to boost the morale of the home front. On Wednesday, 3rd of May 2023, 2 explosions struck the Kremlin, Russia's symbolic heart of government, and the Moscow base of President Vladimir Putin. Grainy video footage captured the 2 small-scale incidents. It does seem likely that 2 drones were employed, but the debate still rages on, distorted by misinformation on both sides. US officials, better placed than you or I to judge the situation, quickly came to the conclusion that the Ukrainians were likely behind the attacks. Russia claimed to have defeated the attack and immediately accused the Ukrainians of trying to assassinate Putin. Ukrainian President Zelensky denied that the attack came from Ukraine, but the incident had a big psychological impact, coming as it did on the anniversary of the 9th of May Victory Parade, when the Russian army was planning to drive through Red Square in the center of Moscow and celebrate victory over Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The message was very clear: Russia is certainly not safe from attack, and that Ukrainian capability was growing by the day. The Ukrainian ability to project drones into Russia continued to evolve, making improvements in size, scale, and capacity. At least one senior Ukrainian commander was heard to boast that they can fly to Moscow and back. The 12-mile-long Russian-built Kerch Bridge, built between 2016 and 2020 after Russia illegally annexed Crimea, links Crimea to Russia. For Ukrainians, it's always been a provocative symbol of the Russian invasion. The bridge has been attacked 3 times since the invasion in February 2022, but not yet by drone. If the bridge could be destroyed, it would be a major propaganda victory for Ukraine and a major disruption to supplies coming into Crimea. Ukrainian intelligence officials have been dropping strong hints that a drone attack against the bridge might also be a course of action they're considering. One Ukrainian official reportedly declared that the bridge will be attacked in the first half of 2024, so we might not have to wait long before we find out. But this might simply be a clever deception operation to keep Russia guessing and forcing it to spread its defensive assets even more thinly and in all directions. In 2023, Ukrainian drone attacks surged. A BBC report in September showed that the strikes were increasing in frequency and range. President Zelensky was less secretive about the use of drones over Russian territory, describing them as an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process. The BBC study concluded that there had been over 190 drone attacks into Russia and Russian-held Crimea in 9 months. There has also been no let-up in 2024. In fact, there was something of a surge in drone attacks in the build-up to the Russian presidential election in March. CNN reported that a wave of 36 drones were launched to coincide with the last day of voting. On the 2nd of April, 2024, Ukrainian drones hit an oil refinery and a drone factory in a Russian industrial area some 1,300 kilometers away from Ukraine. But how effective have these attacks into Russia actually been? Well, we have seen how important the attacks can be for Ukrainian morale, and the drone attacks have certainly put the spotlight on the effectiveness, or otherwise, of Russian air defenses. Firstly, it has meant that Russian defenses have had to be recalled from frontline duty and positioned to protect strategic targets further back in Russia. Secondly, despite the Russian media claims, it seems highly likely that Russian homeland air defenses are performing extremely poorly. Russian strategic air defenses have had a poor reputation for decades. The younger viewers might need to Google this gentleman, Mr. Matthias Rust. He was an exceptionally naive young man who, aged 19 in 1987, at the height of the Cold War, decided to fly his civilian 4-seat Cessna Skyhawk aircraft from Germany to Moscow via Finland in a gesture of peace and friendship. Incredibly, although he should have been shot down immediately, he was entirely untroubled by the layers of Russian ground and air-based defenses throughout his flight. He was certainly noticed a couple of times that the command and control system responsible for tracking was incoherent and confused. When he landed in Red Square in Moscow, it was an appalling embarrassment for the Soviet leadership. The fate of the senior Soviet air defense commanders can only be imagined. And so fast forward to 2024. In April, a Carnegie report assessed Russian anti-drone air defenses as inept, noting that large, slow-moving Ukrainian drones could still float in over the target in broad daylight, choosing their aiming point and approach route carefully and not be at any significant risk. On 5th of April, a particularly successful drone strike hit Rostov military air base, reportedly destroying at least 6 aircraft. The drone attacks against Russian oil production and refining capability look to be intensifying. Fuel and oil are crucial to the Russian war effort and also to civilian life, but the debate about the value of small attacks against refineries and plants is still ongoing. The majority of Russian refining capability is way to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, and realistically is still well out of reach of drones. Putin has prioritized fuel for the military, even if it means hardship for Russian civilians. The damage caused by drones is still relatively small and repairs can be made quickly. Most refineries damaged in a drone strike are usually up and running again within a couple of weeks. But other analysts are more upbeat about the impact. The Economist, a political analytical journal, has claimed that the Ukrainian drone attacks have knocked out a seventh, around 14%, of Russian oil refining capability in total, and that the single attack on the refinery on April 2nd accounted for 3% of capacity. Although Ukraine struggles to sustain waves of attacks died down after the Russian presidential elections, the overall impact of attacks on Russian refineries is significant. The attacks are forcing Russia to take some very expensive and highly public measures to protect its fuel assets, including banning petrol exports, importing fuel from Belarus, and also asking Kazakhstan for assistance. This shows that Russia is experiencing some discomfort from the attacks. Both The Economist and the Carnegie analysts conclude that at present, Ukraine can make and fire drones at Russian refineries at a faster rate than Russia can repair the damage. But there's more. Let's take a look at another aspect of the strategic drone war. Ukraine has next to no navy. Its one frigate was deliberately sunk by the navy to stop it falling into Russian hands. But Ukraine has reinvented naval warfare almost single-handedly by turning to seaborne drones as a means of attacking Russian ships, ports, and naval installations. 6 suicide drones filled with explosives and piloted remotely were reportedly used for the first time in October 2022 as they attempted to ram Russian warships in Sevastopol harbor. This attack is believed to have seriously damaged the frigate Admiral Makarov, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and a minesweeper, the Ivan Golubets. Russian anti-drone defenses, often little more than men armed with machine guns on the decks of their ships, have struggled to find a solution to the threat from very small and fast-moving vessels, often moving at night. The Ukrainians claim to have sunk at least 5 Russian ships with sea drones. These drones have conducted multiple operations around the Black Sea, and now Ukraine can justifiably claim to have the world's first fleet of naval drones. The Magura 5 naval drone is a good example of this new evolution in naval warfare. It's designed like a small motorboat that sits low in the water. It's hard to spot by the naked eye, is made of plastic to avoid radar detection, and does not give off much heat, which thwarts thermal cameras. The Ukrainian commander of a sea drone unit notes that when Russians fire at the drones with tracer rounds, it makes it easier to see where the Russians are firing from and allows evasion measures. Its performance is impressive. With a payload of up to 320 kilograms, it has a range of 800 kilometers and can travel at up to 80 kilometers per hour. The capability of these drones is improving month by month, and the strategic impact of a relatively small number of drones on the Russian Navy has been incredible. The Russians have effectively retreated from the Black Sea and have now pulled back the bulk of the Black Sea fleet hundreds of kilometers east to the port of Novorossiysk on the eastern coast of the Black Sea. Impartial analysts and Ukrainians alike have declared that Ukraine is winning the battle for the Black Sea. With the Russian Navy seemingly no longer willing to contest the Black Sea, this protects Ukraine's southern flank from amphibious attacks, puts Russian-held Crimea in a precarious position, and allows Ukraine to export grain out into the Mediterranean for much-needed revenue. It's clear that Ukraine is achieving military wonders with limited resources but a lot of creative thinking. Although a small fleet of air and sea drones is still unlikely to be a war winner, Ukraine is scoring major military and propaganda victories. But Russia still has a lot of resources, and the situation on the front lines recently appears to be shifting in favor of Russia. Drones are no substitute for artillery shells, modern tanks, and fighter aircraft. Be sure to let us know what you think Ukraine's next steps in the drone war could be, and how you think Russia might respond.